Right, well, thanks everybody for coming. So what we're going to do now is we're going to be concentrating on Rasteau a little bit. Just for 40 minutes or so. It's the afternoon. You've probably all had a wonderful large French lunch, feeling a little bit sleepy. But I've got some lovely, fresh, vibrant, fine examples of Rasteau for you to taste today. So you'll see in your glass that you only have one wine. There will be more wines, don't worry. But I'm always keen that wines, red wines from the Southern Rhône are served at a good temperature. And by that I mean underneath room temperature, a little bit cool, like 15, 16 degrees. And I find it makes a big, big difference to the way they taste. So we're going to be serving the rest of the wines a little bit later after I've talked about terroir a little bit. If we haven't met before, by the way, my name is Matt Walls. I'm a contributing editor to Decanter magazine. I head the Rhône panel for Decanter World Wine Awards, and I've just published a book on the wines of the region. Okay, so Rasteau, yes, freshness and finesse. That's what we're going to be looking for today. So we're going to be looking at 6 wines in total, and for me they all illustrate this kind of fresher, finer side of Rasteau. Now, I think if you ask people about the typical style of Rasteau, people will often kind of use words like powerful, muscular. I mean, what about you guys? I mean, what words would you use to typically describe a classic Rasteau? Any words that kind of spring to mind? Tannic, I would say. Concentrated. Yeah. Anything else? Rich. Yeah. Often quite, what's the word? Potent, I suppose. But there's a bit of a growing, I don't know, do we call it a movement? I suppose movement's not really the right word. It's something of an evolution among some of the estates, particularly some of the estates that have the new generation coming in who are working towards concentrating on a slightly fresher, finer, lighter, more drinkable, a more immediately drinkable style of Rasteau. So I'm going to have a look at some of the facets of the terroir, which can make this happen, some of the methods people can use to accentuate these characteristics in their wines. So to start with, just a few key facts. So, you know, Rasteau, a well-known name amongst Rhône lovers, but the appellation itself was only granted in 2010. I should mention that we're only going to be tasting the still dry wines today. So in Rasteau, they also have the appellation for making vin doux naturel, so sweet wines. Those come in white, rosé, and red, but we're just going to be looking at the still dry reds today, and the dry wines are all red, so there's no white or rosé. When it comes to the grapes, Grenache, it's really the land of Grenache here. Grenache is the most important grape by far. And you have to use Grenache in the blend. You also have to use either Syrah or Mourvèdre. But there are a whole host of the other kind of smorgasbord of wonderful local varieties that you can use just in smaller amounts. The soils are very important here, actually. So we're often talking about clay. There's some stony soils as well. I'm going to go into these in a little bit more detail in a minute. 29% exported, and they make quite a lot of wine. So this is a reasonably large appellation. Nearly 1,000 hectares were bottled as Rasteau in 2020. And yeah, average yield 33 hectolitres per hectare, so not huge. So I think to begin with, we ought to just define what I mean by freshness and finesse. So freshness. In terms of aromas, I'm talking about aromatic vibrancy, I'm talking about definition, I'm talking about being able to kind of pick out individual flavors and aromas rather than this just being a big soup of kind of hot berries. I want to see kind of freshness and definition in the aromas. And also we're talking about fresh fruit flavors, so fresh berries, you know, straight out of the bush, as opposed to dried fruit flavors, so prune, fig, so less of these, more of the fresh fruit flavors. When talking about freshness, you know, on the palate, we're talking about crispness, so I guess we're talking about acidity to a certain degree. You know, I think it's important when you have wines with this kind of opulence and this natural kind of tendency to be quite full, It really helps to have a degree of acidity to help balance that out. But not just acidity. I'm also looking for wines with energy, with vigor, with a sense of tension in the wines, with a sense of focus. And another meaning of the word fresh, pleasantly new, innovative, original, creative. And so here I'm kind of talking about the winemakers, really. Talking about a new generation of winemakers, often who are perhaps better traveled than their parents, who have experienced wines from other parts of the world and how wines are drunk in other parts of the world, and are looking to kind of innovate slightly in the way that they're working. So, finesse. What do we mean by finesse? So again, thinking about the nose of the wine, thinking about aromas, we're thinking about fineness, essentially. Talking about precision, again. Looking for delicacy, looking for detail. So I suppose here we're hoping to find some complexity. Thinking again about the texture of the wine, we're looking for a fine tannic grain. We're not looking for anything too rough, anything too fibrous. We're looking for a smoothness of texture. And favouring balance over excess. I think this is a terroir which kind of really offers the winemaker a lot. You know, this offers a natural rightness. You know, this is quite a hot terroir. This, the wines kind of naturally tend towards being full-bodied, concentration. And sure, you can, you know, as a winemaker, you can accept all of this lovely kind of wealth and make great, big, bold wines. And that's great, and many people do. But then I think some winemakers may choose to not take everything that they're offered, kind of know when to stop, I suppose, and know when to look for slightly different balances. And also, when we talk about finesse, for me it brings to mind a sense of skill. It's a sense of craftsmanship tied to the word finesse. And again, here I'm thinking about the winemakers themselves, the women and the men who are making these wines. I'm thinking about their skill and thinking about their craftsmanship. So we can taste wine number 1, if you haven't already. So this is Domaine Gramillier, and it's his Rasteau Le Marcel 2020. So Domaine Gramillier, it's a guy called Frédéric Julien, and he established this winery. It's very recent, actually, only a few years ago. So this was established in 2017. He has 9 hectares of vines, and they've been grown organically since 2007. So Le Marcel, he makes a few different cuvées, but this one is from a 2.2 hectare plot. It's up relatively high in the hills of Rasteau. I'm going to bring up a couple of maps in a minute just to give you a bit more of an idea of the terroir. And it's exposed to the west. So some of these vines were planted as early as 1901, so there's some very old vines in this plot. And as I was saying, he works organically, he favours very healthy soils, he doesn't use fertiliser of any kind, in fact. And as I was saying, this is the 2020 vintage, so there's a couple of things here I'm going to pull out in a minute, which are things which I think kind of contribute to the freshness of this wine. And the vintage here actually is one of them. So the blend is 85% Grenache, 25% Mourvèdre. Hey. As I was saying, big, generous terroir. They got a lot of everything. Okay, yes, that should be 15% Mourvèdre. Well spotted. Just checking, if people are, awake here. And so the vines here, as I was saying, they're on sloping hillside facing west on kind of marly, sandy, silty soils. Now he uses a proportion of whole bunch, and it's fermented and aged in concrete tanks. So let's have a little taste. So for me, there's some kind of defined blackberry, kind of blackcurrant notes. It's almost like blackcurrant bush. There's a little kind of hint of herbality there on the nose, but I mean that in a positive sense. Quite light on the palate, not terribly extracted. Tannins are quite small, fine. And there's a little green nip there on the palate on the finish there as well, which kind of, I think, accentuates the freshness again a little bit. Good acidity, very moderate alcohol. So a very drinkable, fresh expression of Rasteau. And for me, Domaine Gramillier is always one of those names which come kind of immediately to mind when I think about this fresher style of Rasteau. So as I was saying, a couple of things here which contribute to the freshness. The vintage is one of them. So 2020 was, it was a reasonably hot year, again, dry during the growing season, again, as it has been for several of the recent vintages. But for some reason, the wines are much, much fresher in 2020 than they are in 2019. They are, generally speaking, they are more moderate in alcohol. They are slightly higher in acidity than 2019. They're not quite as bold and full-bodied and concentrated as 2019. But that said, you know, this isn't a kind of, it's not unusual, nonetheless, for Gramillier to be in this style. It's not just the vintage that we're getting here. Now, he uses a proportion of whole bunch, which is a growing trend throughout the Rhône Valley. And I think, generally speaking, a very positive trend. Use of whole bunch in Rasteau is actually relatively rare. I mean, you see it quite often in Châteauneuf-du-Pape, you see it quite often in Gigondas. In Rasteau, they don't do it quite so often. But Frédéric Julien is one that does. And that's one of the things, I think, where we're getting this little bit of this little kind of herbal freshness from. Sometimes using whole bunch can slightly reduce levels of acidity, but it doesn't seem to be a problem in this wine. There's still nice freshness, good sense of acidity, so it hasn't kind of it hasn't impacted the wine in that way. But what stems can do is also soak up a little bit of alcohol, so that might be another reason why you don't get any kind of alcohol heat on this wine. You can. I will get the bottle and I will look at it and I will tell you, because I don't have that info. Can I tell you exactly what the alcohol is? I can. Bear with me. Anybody like to guess? 15%. But it doesn't taste like it to me. It tasted very much in balance. That's okay. That's what it says on the label. But it says the Le Masra 2020. So yeah, there we go. Okay, so moving on. So just to locate ourselves. So here we are in the southern Rhône. Here we have Châteauneuf-du-Pape. So as we kind of move, it's about 20 kilometers away from Châteauneuf-du-Pape. So we have this large hill here in between the two rivers. So we have the Uvez here and we have the Aigue here. And so over time, they have deposited all these alluvial soils on either side of the hill of Rasteau and Queyranne. Those alluvials have made the Plan de Dieu, but the hill of Rasteau and Queyranne is very different. So this is a very large kind of hummock of marl, essentially, so clay limestone, with various kind of smatterings of pebbles and galets over it. So it's broadly south-facing. The western half of the hill is Queyranne. The eastern half of the hill is Rasteau. They share a border down the middle, but the style is slightly different. So we're on the eastern half of this hill here in Rasteau. So a little bit more detail. So this we tend to, when we talk about Rasteau, we tend to kind of split it into three parts because it's just kind of easier to think about. So down here we have Le Plan. So I mentioned the Plan de Dieu earlier on, this kind of bed of kind of fairly recent alluvials laid down by the two rivers. This is one of them here, the Uvez. The Aigue would be over here. And it's almost like Rasteau have kind of annexed a little section of Le Plan de Dieu for themselves. So here we have those kind of relatively recent alluvials. It's quite flat, it's quite low-lying, about 120 meters altitude, and it's relatively kind of hot terroir. Then as we start moving towards the hillier areas here, the Terrasse de Crapon here, this is when we start kind of encountering those emblematic blue marls that so many people talk about when they talk about their Rasteau. So marl is very important in that all of this part of, well, this kind of central part, the center part here, and the montagne here. But these blue marls here are where we start to kind of gain in altitude a little bit as well. So here we have the village of Rasteau, and then as it starts to rise up this kind of reasonably south-facing hill that I was talking about, on top of these blue marls, you also get these yellow marls as well. And it gets increasingly hilly and vallonné, as they would say. There's a great big kind of crevasse down the middle here. And I was talking to a winemaker fairly recently when I was there, and he said, you know why it's called Rasteau, don't you? I said, no, I've no idea. And he said, well, in French, it's the word râteau, which is a rake, because this is almost raked with about 6 or 7 kind of fairly deep valleys, which gives all these different exposures. So we have east-facing, west-facing, even some north-facing slopes for winemakers to play with. And I also just ought to say a couple of things just on the other elements of the terroir. Kind of no big surprises here, no big influences over these things. We get the classic Mediterranean climate. It's very hot here, as we know. There's no big influences over the rainfall here particularly. I think we're slightly sheltered from the wind because we're on the south face of this slope. But aside from that, it's kind of fairly classic in terms of climate here for the Southern Rhône. And I just wanted to put this photo up just to kind of help illustrate these marls a little bit and just to show kind of quite how clear they are. If you go there, you can see them all with the naked eye. So this little blue arrow here points to the blue marls, fairly low down. And then you get these yellow marls on top. And then actually you get this thin band of kind of red clay marl on top as well. But you tend to see that actually more on the Plan de Dieu as well, but that's kind of very thin compared to these thick bands of yellow and blue. And it's called blue marl. It's actually grey. If you look at it, it's grey. But when it gets wet, if it rains, it takes on this little blue sheen. So that's why they call it blue marl. It's really grey. So the next wine in your glass. So this is Domaine La Luminaille, Luminaris 2020. Now, I've put a little mistake here on the slide for Jamie Good for him to see if he can notice. I'm going to see if you can spot it. So, but in the meantime, I'm going to tell you about this wine. So this is a lovely estate. It's an estate I like a lot. It's a woman called Julie Paolucci. So she took over the family domain in 2014. She was a sommelier. Actually, she used to live in London. She travelled the world. So she has a very broad view of wine, how wine is drunk and how it is enjoyed all over the world. She has 9 hectares in the Lieu dit La Luminaille, which is just behind the village. And they also have a few hectares slightly higher up in La Gelegrière aussi. They make 2 different Rasteau cuvées, one called Luminaris. And they also she also makes another one called Garance, which is a kind of an old vine cuvée. And she makes a little bit of sweet wine too. So this particular wine is 40% Grenache, 30% Syrah, 25% Carignan, 5% Mourvèdre, certified organic. And the soils here, it's these blue marls, as we were talking about. There's a bit of limestone here. There's also quite a kind of generous smattering of galets. You kind of see kind of little groups of galets kind of here and there throughout Rasteau, particularly as you go up high into the hills. Fermented and aged in clay, and a very kind of bright style. I'm going to have a little taste. Lovely sense of freshness on the nose. Kind of forest berry fruit, I suppose. I love that feeling of fluidity on the palate. There's some tannins there, but they just kind of give a little sense of tightness. They're not overwhelming at all. Good acidity. There's some length there as well. But for me, I love the acidity. There's really a lovely, overwhelming sense of drinkability. I would really just love to drink a glass of this wine right now. I think it's absolutely delicious. So again, we're looking at 2020 vintage. And as Jamie has no doubt noticed, I've got the wrong cuvée here. I've got the Garance here instead of the Luminaris because I switched it at the last minute. And yeah, just a lovely, lovely wine, I think. Any questions, comments on this one? You're tasting... No, it's a different cuvée. Let me show you. It looks almost identical. As you can see, it looks very similar. But this is Luminaris, and it says Garance here. But this is Luminaris. This one here. This is what you're drinking, the Luminaris. Sorry, any comments? Any questions about this one? I'm seeing some kind of nodding heads and appreciation. Generally, people seem to like it. Yeah? Yeah, great. Okay. And a couple of things which are bringing the freshness on this. I think I was talking about freshness of innovation, originality, creativity, and I think a lot of the freshness of this wine is coming from Julia. It's coming from what she wants to make. You know, she's seen so many different wines on her travels as a sommelier, and she's kind of perhaps, you know, travelled better than some of the old generation who've lived in Rasteau for a long time. And also there's quite a lot of Carignan in the blend, so 25% Carignan. And so Carignan gets a bit of a bad rep sometimes, which I think is not always deserved. I think old vine Carignan can be absolutely lovely. And one of the real benefits to Carignan here is actually it can bring quite a lot of acidity. So even if you're picking it late, it tends to retain its acidity quite well. So that's quite welcome in Rasteau to bring the balance. Also fermenting and aging in amphora. So again, for me, that tends to give a kind of a degree of freshness to the wines if you compare with, say, you know, kind of New Oak Barriques or something like that. So anyway, so that's the Luminae. So you should all have wine number 3 in your glass. So let's move on to wine number 3. So this is Domaine Elodie Balme. It's her Rasteau 2020, so our third 2020. And for me, Elodie is really, she's one of the rising stars of Rasteau. I mean, I think she's gone past rising. I think she is one of the stars of Rasteau. And so she took over her parents' operation in, let me see, 2006, there we go. And in fact, it was just this year recently, she kind of took a proportion out of the co-op, and now she's bottling all of their estate. So she doesn't take anything else to the co-op anymore. And she tends to opt for kind of very short maceration. Now, when I spoke to her the other day, she said there are 3 quality factors, the 3 most important things she would say when it comes to making wine. Number 1, the terroir. Number 2, the rootstock. Number 3, the age of the vines, in that order. That's what she says. So let's have a little taste of this and see what we think. I just love that nose. There's a little spiciness to it, kind of cinnamon spice. And it's almost as if there's a little kind of splash of olive brine in there, kind of like Kalamata olive brine. Probably coming from the Syrah. So there's a generosity there on the palate that you would expect from Rasteau. A little kind of hint of sucrosity, a little hint of sweetness of fruit that you would classically see in Rasteau. But there's a fluidity there. Tannins, again, not overbearing, not too heavy. It's not overly concentrated. There's a big burst of flavour, but without too much without too much extraction, without too much concentration. It's a wine that I really like a lot. Okay, any questions, any comments? Yeah. Which do I prefer of the 2? I love them both, and these are both wines that I personally buy and that I drink. I really like them both. It's very hard to pick between them. I think in some ways with the Luminae, I tend to when I think about if I had 2 bottles to choose from out of the rack, I would think the Luminae is likely to be a little bit straighter, a little bit fresher. Elodie Balme tends to be just a little bit rounder on the palate, but they tend to be both kind of equally fresh and drinkable. I think they both make lovely wines. Okay, so wine number 4. So we're changing vintage here, and I think you're going to notice that in the wine. So we're moving to 2019. This is Domaine des Banquettes. This is Rasteau 2019. So this is Patrice and Christelle André. So they have a 30-hectare estate. Not all in Rasteau. They have some Rasteau, they have some Sablé, they have some Plan de Dieu. And so he was a mechanic, actually, but he then inherited the family estate and decided that he was going to do it. He was going to take the vines, he was going to run with it, he was going to make the wine. Well, he didn't make the wine, but he did deliver the grapes to the co-op. Now, eventually, in 2002, I think eventually he became Secretary General of the co-op. But then he managed to kind of extract himself from that, decided he's going to build his winery, he's going to build a winery, he's going to do his own thing, make his own wine. So he did that in 2002. So it's actually been in the family since 1910, the vineyards at least. And his grandfather was part of the founding members of the cooperative. So this particular wine is 50% Grenache, 25% Mourvèdre, and 25% Syrah, which is a pretty classic blend, really. Clay limestone soils, certified HVE, which is Haute Valeur Environnementale, which is a kind of really reasonably recent French certification program. Relatively short maceration times, 15 to 20 days, typically, with temperature control, quite light extraction, and then matured in stainless steel. So let's have a little taste. Do we all have wine number 4? I don't. That's all right. Thanks. There we go. So there's a little hint of violet on the nose. Yeah, it's nice, eh? Little blueberry thing. A little bramble jelly. Immediately more round, more opulent, a little richer than the 3 previous wines. And to a degree, I would imagine that's down to vintage. This is what I would expect from 2019. I would expect slightly higher alcohols, slightly richer, more concentrated. It's a lovely vintage. It's just slightly different in style. I think 2019 and 2020 are probably, like, one is not necessarily better than the other. They're just slightly different stylistically. So the things that are bringing the freshness here, relatively shorter macerations. I would imagine that 30 days is probably more typical in the more in most Rasteaus, and also relatively light extraction. You know, just little light remontage, and I think this is one of the principal changes between the older, more kind of traditional, big, powerful Rasteaus and the finer styles that we're beginning to see kind of blossom at the moment. A lot of it is down to much lighter extraction. And also matured in stainless steel, which can kind of help give a particular kind of clarity, I suppose, to the wine. And wine number 5. So Domaine Notre-Dame de Palière, and it's the Les Ribes 2019. So this is owned by Claude Roux, actually, but it's mostly his children that are in charge now, Isabelle and Julien. So they have quite a big estate. Let me see. Yeah, they have some Gigondas, they have some Rasteau, they have some Sablé, some Lirac, and also some Côte de Rhône. They tend to work organically. I don't think they're certified organic, but they tend to work to organic principles. And they tend to try and kind of look after the health of the soil as well. So, for example, you know, if they're replanting, they'll leave it grassed for, you know, a number of years before they replant. So this particular wine, 70% Grenache, 15% Mourvèdre, 10% Syrah, 5% Sanso, and they're all planted in Gobelet, so all bush vines. And I guess the important thing about this particular wine, so this is all from a little parcel, but right there in the hills. It's called La Ratanneau, at 360 meters altitude. Relatively long maceration, so over 30 days here. But nonetheless, I think we're going to find freshness in the wine. Fermented in concrete, and some of which is aged in older barriques. So let's have a little taste. So quite a kind of fresh, elegant Rasteau perfume. Kind of lightly perfumed. Good acid balance. There's some tannin there, kind of little springy tannins that kind of ride in there on the finish. Again, I think we kind of sense the alcohol perhaps just a little bit more in than the three previous wines, but in the three previous wines. But again, this is 2019, not 2020. A bit more textural, a bit more tannic than some of the previous wines we've been tasting, but nonetheless with a nice sense of tension and a nice sense of kind of rising freshness there on the finish. So what's bringing the freshness here is partly Sansol. So there's not a great deal of Sansol planted in Rasteau, but people are they're talking about it more, looking to plant it more, along with more Carignan as well. So there's 5% Sansol. So Sansol is a lovely grape variety, tends to bring that freshness, tends to bring the fluidity, tends to also ripen at lower alcohols. So helps bring the overall alcohol level down a little bit. And these are all planted in Goblet. So I think again this is they take longer to work. They're a little bit more difficult to work. These kind of bush vines. But they also have added benefits, such as being able to shade the grapes a little bit more, which is another way of kind of helping to bring some freshness into the wine. But I think the main element here is the altitude, so 360 meters altitude. So that's really where I think the freshening influence is coming from here. And wine number 6, so this is Domaine Wilfrid. It's their Rasteau 2017. So I wanted to show something with a little bit more age. So we've skipped 2018 and gone to 2017 now. So this is 5 years old. So this is it's an estate owned by Réjean and Wilfried Pouzelas. 5th generation, their brother and sister. Certified organic. They took over in 2007, and the Grenache is from the 1970s, so quite old vine Grenache. And they have 36 hectares across Queyran and Rasteau. Let's have a little taste. So immediately very kind of brambly on the nose. So for French people in the audience, what do we mean by brambly? I guess we're thinking about kind of black currants, sorry, not black currants, but black berries of kind of varying ripeness. I think sometimes you kind of you think about the bush as well, the kind of herbality you might get from the kind of the bush as well as the fruit. So quite rich on the palate, but for me has taken on a really nice kind of harmony at the moment. Everything feels very much together. In 2017, sometimes the tannins in 2017 can be a little bit unruly because it was very, very dry, and there was an awful lot of skins compared to juice in a lot of the grapes, a lot of the Grenache in that year. But this is starting to kind of soften up a little bit now. So this is 60% Grenache, 20% Carignan, 20% Syrah, certified organic, and their vines are actually on Le Plan, so they're relatively low down. So although that tends to be quite a kind of a hot terroir, often people like that terroir for making their vin du naturel, you can make quite elegant still wines there as well. So typically 15 to 18 days maceration, and very, very light on the extraction, so just 2 remontage every 3 days. It's matured in concrete for 12 months, and I chose this because I wanted to show the kind of the elegance and finesse that can come with a little bit of age, because that's another element I think that we can think about when we think about finesse in Rasteau. Any comments about this one? Too old for anyone? Or about right? No? Too old for this gentleman here, yeah? Generally speaking, yeah, people seem to be enjoying that. Relatively traditional, yeah, relatively traditional. But I like that sense of finesse that we get after a few years of it being, in bottle, just to buff out those tannins a little bit. Wine 6, 12 months in 12 months in concrete tank. No oak, no. So, just to sum up, I think I've hoped I've shown a kind of a fresher, finer style of Rasteau that perhaps you guys might be used to, and that can come from a variety of different things. Sometimes it comes from the terroir itself. It could be the altitude, because Rasteau does have a certain degree of altitude and rise up to 360 meters. And as I was mentioning, it's very hilly, so there are different exposures. We have west-facing, east-facing, even some north-facing vineyards. And really, a lot of it is down to these clay soils, so water retaining, particularly good with old vines. They can plunge their vines deep down, and they can be nourished with water and other micronutrients throughout the season. So particularly useful in these very hot, very dry summers that we've been seeing recently. Freshness can also come from the grape varieties. So the usage of Saint-Saul, particularly usage of Carignan. I think people are beginning to really appreciate Carignan again. I don't think it's been quite as appreciated in recent times, but now I think people are coming back to it. They're seeing how well it performs in the drought conditions that we're seeing in a lot of summers these days, and how it retains its acidity. Viticulture as well. So as I mentioned before, old vines can help give this sense of freshness. I think if you have very young vines in very, very hot, very, very dry conditions, sometimes you can get some kind of either baked fruit flavors or kind of jammy flavors. So old vines can help, of which there are many in Rasteau. And also growing in Gorbelet can help. When it comes to vinification, picking dates. So, this is a big one, really. People tend to be, or certainly the wineries that we've been tasting here, picking a little bit earlier. There's a degree of whole bunch fermentation here and there, so that can help bring a bit of freshness. Reducing maceration time, much easier on the extraction. I think this is a really key one. Temperature control, of course, and also carbonic maceration. But again, this is pretty rare in Rasteau at the moment. Looking at élevage, the length of time, and also kind of choosing the right vessels. So choosing cement, choosing amphora, as we've seen. Sometimes stainless steel can be a good option for these wines if you want to keep this kind of sense of uprightness, of tension, freshness. And also fresh ideas. So it's really coming from the new generation who have perhaps travelled a little bit, have tasted more widely, have lived elsewhere, and are bringing new ideas and a fresh way of looking at the terroir. So not to kind of betray the terroir, not to create kind of completely new styles of wine, but to keep the heart and soul of Rasteau, but in a kind of more immediately accessible and drinkable way. So that's it for today. I hope you all enjoyed the wines. Should we get a show of hands for favourites? So wine number 1? No, nobody. Wine number 2? Yeah, a few. Wine number 3? Lots of fans. Wine number 4? Yeah, a couple. Wine number 5? A couple. Wine number 6? Yeah, a few here. Hmm? Yeah, and I think it is very good. I think, and a lot of people have raised their hands with the Elodie Balm as well, I must admit. Any questions? Hi. The price point, good question. I'm not always given the prices, actually, so I don't have the individual exact prices for these wines, but I can give you an impression. So let me get the bottles. I think the Le Marcel from Gramelier, I'm going to have to talk in UK retail, but that should at least going to give you a bit of an idea. I would imagine that would be about £18. The Banquet, I don't think is available in UK retail, but I would imagine that to be slightly lower. I've missed out the Luminai. So the Luminai Luminaris, I think, is about £22 UK retail. Elodie Baum, again, probably about £22 UK retail. Banquette we've mentioned. The Notre Dame de Palier, in the region of £20. They're all pretty much, around the same level, really. I mean, none of these are like a kind of a particularly super expensive Uber Cuvée. And the Wilfrid, yeah, again, probably £22, there or thereabouts. Yeah, so they're all more or less in the same ballpark, I would say. Yeah. Any other questions? No? Great. Well, I hope you enjoyed them. There's more Rasteau downstairs, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the fair.